Well, I've been asked many times by different people to have a go at doing a video on how to make a hood. I have to say I'm getting to the point now where my hands start to lock up from holding the needles. It's very difficult to hold them and sew, so I thought now's the time to do it before I can no longer make a hood. I'm going to show you a couple of different hoods that I've made through various times of my life. First of all, we're going to go to this one. Where is it? That's a little one-piece Dutch hood made for a little hybrid falcon I have. That one there is once again another one-piece Dutch hood that's made for my chair. There's a very old hood that I made back in the 80s, a Dutch proper, 3 pieces of leather that one's made from. Now that one was for Alana, and like I say, a long time ago I made that one. And then this one is a copy of a Carmolan hood which was made by a late friend of mine, a guy called Jim Giles. Very talented hood maker, very good breeder and an excellent falconer, and he got me into flying Saker falcons, of which I still fly to this day. Now, to make a hood you need a few basic materials. First thing you need is a piece of tooling calf like this one here. That's about 2 mil in thickness. You can buy this off eBay in actual fact. Once you've got your leather, you also need a pattern. Okay, you can buy various patterns on, I've actually seen them for sale on eBay, and there's various falconry equipment suppliers that also sell patterns. All of the patterns I've got I've had since I was a young kid, as I've now been making hoods for 32 years. Obviously I'm on a cutting board there as well. Then I've got a little screwdriver that I use for a stylus for marking out the pattern, a scalpel, a packet of James 03 Glover's needles. I mean, I buy needles by the packet. There's 25 in a packet, but you can buy them singly. They're sword edge chemically sharpened needles. Then you've got a stitch marker. That one's 8 stitches to the inch. And then you've got a gauge. There's a little awl there, that's another tool that I made myself for making the holes in the leather for sewing. A pack of dental floss. I've got a little leather thimble there that I put over my fingers. Some more blades. There's a swivel knife for marking out the beak opening. Now I'll just show you this pattern. This is one that I cut out earlier. That's that one there. That's had all the stitches marked in it. It's all gauged out. The beak openings are in the rough right place. I don't actually cut the beak opening out until the hood's finished. I just find it alters the stretch of the leather. So let's go back on the table. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is get back in my chair. So you take your hood pattern. This is a one-piece Dutch. The reason I'm doing a one-piece is because the percentage rate of good hoods to not so good hoods is greatly reduced when you go sewing hoods with 3 pieces of leather. So this is a one-piece one. It's basically a Dutch pattern. You put the eyepiece to the pattern and draw around and obviously cut it out so both eyepieces are on there together. You want a piece of leather that's roughly the right shape and the right size for the pattern to go onto, like so. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit short that end, because as you see by that line across there, that's where the back of the pattern comes to. And all I use is a little tiny screwdriver, one of these little engineering ones, just to use it as a stylus, just to mark out the pattern. This little tab that's on the bottom here, that's that one, that's just to use to position the hood when it's put on the hood block. Now, hood blocks are another thing. You can buy them online. However, most of the hood blocks I've got, I've made myself, and depending on the response I get from this little video, I will probably show you how to make your own hood block and how to make your own pattern as well. It's a long drawn out process, and of course if you start hood making at an early stage in your life like I did, you've got your whole life to get it right. So that's the pattern scored out onto the leather. Then you take a scalpel, and when it comes to cutting, cut from the corners out. Don't go into the corners, otherwise you tend to end up with little crosses marked in there. So all I'm going to do is just cut this pattern out. I always try and bevel the cutting edge slightly, and that way you get a nice tight seam where you can't let any light in, because obviously the idea of the hood is to keep the bird in relative darkness. That's that piece out. I'll just cut this piece out now. I'll take my glasses off. I find it's a bit more tricky to see with glasses on these days. And yeah, like I said, I started making hoods at an early age of probably about 17, 18 years old. Because when I first started in the sport of falconry, there was very few people about that would help you. In actual fact, it was very much an elitist sport, and there was only a certain amount of falconers that were out there that would actually take you under their wing, so to speak, and show you the basics of how to handle your birds. So you had to learn how to make the furniture yourself. So there's the pattern cut out. And what I'm going to do is take this gauge. These tools, by the way, certainly these two, are available from the Identity store, which is online. A nice lady called Jackie, she's always there willing to help. I've gauged this so that the stitches are about 5mm from the edge, and all you do is just lean it over, run one edge around where you've cut, and it will mark you a nice little mark down the edge of the eyepieces and the centrepiece of the hood. A bit tricky in the corners, you might have to go backwards and forwards a couple of times. Now what I do is I look at the hood and I think, right, that there is about straight, so that's going to be the start for my stitches. Don't need that anymore now. Next stage is to take a stitch marking wheel. Like I said, this one's 8 stitches to the inch, and all you do is start from where you've made your mark here, and just don't push it too hard that you actually puncture the leather. You're just trying to make a little impression so you can see where the stitches are. Try and get it on the line if you can, it does help in the long run. You'll find there is quite a bit of wastage with these hoods, but what I tend to do is when I cut them out of a pattern, out of a piece of leather, when I get to the point where I've got lots of little bits on the within the skin that are no longer needed, provided they're as big as an eyepiece, you can actually cut them out and make them into 3-piece Dutch hoods. Now, there's various ways of sewing a Dutch hood. One of the ways is to do what's called a locking stitch. That one is a running stitch in actual fact. Locking stitch in this one. So that's locked it over. You move from one to the next, and it's not quite a zigzag or a cross stitch. It's just a locking stitch. One stitch locks off the other. The only thing is they do look awfully messy and untidy. The other way is to do a running stitch, as I'll demonstrate with this one. Gives you a nice clean inside. Most people that use Dutch hoods don't know the difference between having the stitching on the inside or the outside. I've actually had people say, well, the stitch touched the bird's eyes. Well, if it touches the bird's eyes, it's in the wrong place anyway. I've also had people say that the stitching on the outside of a hood, like this one here, well, the birds can get their talons caught in there. Okay, well, I must be honest, I've never had it happen, but it could happen. So this is a running stitch, and the idea of actually stitching it with the stitching on the outside is you get less wastage, so your hoods will stitch up quite quickly. So that's the stitches marked. Then you take a little awl. This one I've made up to so I've got a gauge, so if I ever break it and I want to make another one, I've made it so it fits the centre of my fingertip perfectly. That's the bend that's on it. And the idea is, you don't want to go straight through the leather, you want to go in through the top and out through the side of it. Now I normally start with the eyepieces and count the stitches. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Okay, so then all you need to do is to come up 24 on this side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So that will be the end of the hood. And as you can see, all the stitches have come out through the thickness of the hood rather than going straight through. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put that one aside. I've got one here which is already marked out. Before I put that one away, what I will do is just put a beak opening on there. And somewhere I've had a pattern with a small beak opening on it. So I'm going to place that roughly in the middle where I want it to be. Doesn't matter too much whether it's spot on or not, because I always make the beak opening too small so that you can enlarge it later. So I've marked that on there, like so. Then I'll use a swivel knife to mark this properly. This just slightly cuts into the skin of the leather, into the skin side, rather than right through into the flesh. And that's how you just do your basic beak opening. Now the idea of with the swivel knife, because it's just scored through the skin, is that it will actually stay there right through the blocking process. So I'm just going to go and wet this a moment, only be a few seconds. So that's that all nice and wet. There are people that will sew up a hood dry. I prefer to sew them up wet. What I find is when you sew them up wet, when the stitching puckers up on the seam, it will flatten out better, and it also pulls the stitches up a lot tighter than what you could with dry leather. Especially as these days a lot of people that will sell you a piece of hood leather is normally a piece of leather that's been hanging around in a cupboard indoors, drying out for some period of time, and it's become very brittle. So you've always got to pay that in mind. So the next stage with this is to sew it up. Now I use dental floss. There are lots of different threads out there you can buy. I've heard of people even using Kevlar thread. But I use dental floss. I just find it's convenient. It's already waxed, so it's waterproof. Back in the old days when people like Carl Morland made hoods, they used linen thread, and then they'd get some beeswax and run the linen thread through the beeswax in order to waterproof the thread. The eyes of these needles is very small, and with practice you'll find that you can actually put the thread through without any problem. Like I said, it does take a little bit of practice. So I've got 2 needles on there. There are people that will sew with 1. I find that 2 are a lot better, and it gives you a lot better seam. And you can use the little metal thimbles, but as I always use that part of my finger as the place where I push my needle from, I put a piece of leather on like so. So you take the first needle, find the first stitch, push it right through. Shouldn't take a lot of force because you've already made the holes. Bring it down to about halfway like so. Then take your other needle, go on to your next stitch, find the little hole which is just there, and pass it through. Don't pull that tight, because all you'll do is pull the needle, the thread right through onto the other side. So you're just pinching it with your finger. And just find the hole again, come back on yourself. So at this point you've made your first stitch, and then you just go on to the next one. Give it a little pull, not too much, because at the moment there's not a lot of resistance. Do the same with the other one. Pass it through the hole. Give it another little pull. Go on to the next one. And you basically work your way around the hood. What you've got to try and do is keep your finger up underneath the seam and put your thumb over the top of the seam. Then that way you keep the hood together as you sew. Because the main thing is to keep those stitches lined up as you're going around. If you don't keep them lined up, you'll find you get to the end and there's a difference between maybe 2 or 3 stitches. And the problem is then, is when you go to block it, you'll find that your hood is all lopsided. So you just try and keep the stitches together and make sure that you keep it all sewn up even. I apologise for bringing the hood up so high to the camera and taking it out of focus every now and again. It's the first time I've ever actually done this in front of a camera, so it's an interesting little exercise even for me, who spends most of his life in front of people giving talks on demonstrations of birds of prey and so on. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, people have often asked me, you know, can you show me how to make one? Well, back in my day I used to be a hood maker, and I used to sell hoods all over the country. In fact, I've sold them all over the world at one point or another. But unfortunately I've now got to the point where I've got a little bit of arthritis in my hands, and you'll find that as I get through this hood, I'll get 2/3 of the way through this side of the hood, and you'll see I'll have to give my hands a shake when they cramp up. And eventually I'm going to get to the point where I can't hold the needles to do the job. And let's face it, there's so many good hood makers out there these days, youngsters that are coming on, that I'm hoping that one day I'll find somebody who's keen and willing, who wants to learn how to make them, and I'm going to probably give them all my knowledge and give them all my patterns and hood blocks, and let them carry on and make my hoods for me, as I did with my old friend Jim Giles. I used to look upon him as the best hood maker in the world at one point, and he got to the point where he used to turn around to me and say, "Andy, I need a hood for a Seiko, can you make me one?" "Why can't you do it, Jim?" "Oh, my hands lock up," he says. And I used to laugh and think, yeah, it's all funny. But now it's come round to me. I've finally got to that age in my life where the old hands don't work like they used to. It's like lure swinging. In actual fact, there was a time I used to pride myself on being able to fly a falcon to the lure for what seemed like hours. These days I get past about 25-30 passes and my arms feel like they're going to fall off. I just can't do it the way I used to. Happens to all of us. So yeah, that's why I've decided to put this together, so I can give people the basics whereby they can make their own hoods. I've probably done a lot of this out of view of the camera, but never mind. Because I believe that every falconer should be able to make their own basic equipment. I mean, Anglo-Indian hoods are very easy to make. These days you've got people that do blocked ones. I do blocked ones as well. But you know what? The time it takes to make an Anglo-Indian hood, you just as well get the right leather and learn how to use a hood block and make your own Dutch style hoods. I have to say my preference of them all is a very well made Arab hood, but not many people have got the good patterns for them anymore. And all of these sort of things are all dying arts, because sooner or later someone's going to come up with an idea of a plastic that you can melt down, that you can shrink down onto a hood block and make the perfect hood without it making the bird sweat. And when that happens, making hoods out of leather will be a thing of the past. And I'm sure it's not too far away. But like I say, this is just basics of how to put one together. And I probably make this sewing look quite easy, and for me it is, but you never know. You might take to it like a duck to water as well. And when I do displays and people ask me about the little caps or helmets that birds of prey wear, I always say, how many of you men out there can sew? And most of them say none of them. No, most of them say they can't. But sewing's something that's quite easy. Now, when I first started making hoods, I didn't realise that you had to make the holes for your stitches. And you'll be sewing a hood there one day, and the little bit of leather that you got round your finger that you're pushing against will become weakened just about there. And you'll be sewing away and you'll hear this horrible popping sound, and then you'll realise quickly with horror that the back of the needle has gone through the leather and it's now in your finger. So I always say that when I make a hood, there's blood, sweat and tears go into it. Blood from when the needle pops your finger, sweat from when you sit outside in the sun and do it, and tears from the pain that goes through you when you get to the very last part of sewing, of making your hood, where you're cutting the beak opening out and you slip with the scalpel and your beak opening will no longer fit the bird you want it to, and then you realise with horror that that hood's got to go in the bin and you've got to start again. But hopefully with a bit of practice you'll get there and you'll start making a reasonable quality hood. I think I'm going to do this video in two parts. This will be part one, and then in part two we'll be putting the hood together once it's been put on the block and it's dried out. So that's that sewn up anyway. Snip the end off, and that's the basics of how you sew up a one-piece Dutch hood from the outside. I suppose I probably should go on and sew the other side up for you as well. Okay, now once that's actually sewn up, I will sew the other side up as well, and in the part 2 you'll see this hood sat on a block, and it should look something like that one. That's already been placed on the block. It's slowly starting to dry out, and I've also started to work the block. So I'm going to take a break for now. This is the end of part 1 of this little video, and we'll carry on afterwards once I've actually got this hood sewn up and on the block, and that one will be on the next stage.